Hi, and welcome back to Painting with Bennett. I hope you're having a good winter and have been having a good start to the new year as well. And it's been a long time coming, but over the past couple of months, I've been slowly painting up my own Blood Bowl team. A local game group is going to be running a Blood Bowl league in a month or so, and so I figured that's the perfect excuse to paint up a team and try out the game.
Plus, I have this awesome Lizardman Proxy Team to paint, and these aren't just lizards, these are sharks. I honestly love these sculpts so much. They're just so fun to me and so full of character. The minis are by Racco Vendetta eStudio, and I had these printed for me by JG Forge. And I'll take the chance to plug his services whenever I can. He's a super nice guy, the prints are always good quality and durable, and the price is very reasonable as well. I'm not affiliated or anything, but I'll put a link to his website in the video description in case you want to check it out. Also, I printed this little fish guy from Vevictus Miniatures to use as my team mascot. Honestly, this was just too funny for me to pass up, and I already used the Reverse Merman from Bit Trip Runner 2 as my frequent online moniker or profile picture and all that stuff, so it just matches really well, and I think it's pretty funny. Anyway, we'll cut over to the painting desk. Taking a minute to examine these models, they printed and came out with great quality. There's just a few supports here and there to clean up, but honestly that only took 15 minutes total. I also got these pre-textured bases printed for this team as well, and I decided to use one 40mm base for the big great white shark, so that can be my sort of Croxigore proxy, and it looks quite a bit bigger than the rest, so I think a 40mm base fits well. For all the rest of them, I opted for 32mm bases. The sharks that are proxies for the Saurus blockers do overhang on the bases a bit, but I don't want too many 40mm bases to clutter up the board and make the grid spaces way too cramped. Then assembling the minis to the bases, I really don't like pinning, and in addition to that, 3D printed resin can be notoriously brittle. The JG Forge prints are really sturdy, but I still don't want to take the risk of breaking anything on accident. So I did my classic trick of using a tiny dot of green stuff on the foot and putting super glue around it on both sides, then pressing down the mini's feet onto the base. This provides much more contact surface for the foot to touch the base with, and when it dries it becomes a very solid connection. I've done this quite a bit before, and I have yet to encounter any issues with stability, fingers crossed, when doing this instead of pinning. And to add a bit of interest to the bases, I'm adding some of these little shells and starfish and such. Don't ask me why these are sitting on wooden planks. It doesn't really have to make sense. I'm just doing it for visual interest. Then I also used some PVA glue to apply some sand in little patches to a handful of the bases. I'm also not really sure why sand would be on these wooden planks, but Blood Bowl isn't a game that's really concerned about realism anyway, so I'm just trying to match the aesthetic I want to go for. And side note, if you're on the fence about getting a proxy team like this for Blood Bowl, honestly, for me, it was so good for my momentum on this project to just be able to dive into the painting steps right away and not really have to spend a whole time doing model prep and assembly. I'm fairly slow, I think, at assembling and cleaning up models, so a lot of the time when I'm done with those steps, I'm already kind of tired of projects and, ready to move on to something else. So anyway, I guess I'm just saying that it's kind of refreshing to be able to dive into just painting a 3D printed team like this. I primed the models with my airbrush in a light tan color, which I got by mixing a bit of black-brown primer into white primer. You can use any neutral gray primer that you have here, it really doesn't matter too much. Once the primer cured, I airbrushed most of the sharks with this bluish-gray skin color, which will be the color of most of their skin. Then I airbrushed a lighter bluish-white highlight on this, and then pushed the highlights even further with another pass. Then I switched to just airbrushing the underbellies, and I did this with one of my favorite colors, Vallejo Model Color Pale Gray Blue, and I did 2 coats of this to build up some good coverage. Almost all of the sharks on this team got these colors, but I airbrushed some brown colors instead on these two sharks that looked like a goblin shark and a sawtooth shark. I want to have the option to run a couple of these sharks as proxies for the chameleon skinks instead of just the regular skinks, so that's the reason for these different skin tones on these two sharks. I'm doing the same exact process as before, just swapping out my colors for some brown colors instead of blue colors. I decided before anything else to first start refining the skin, because these steps will be a little bit messy. I thinned down some Tyrian Navy speed paint quite a bit with medium, and then I thinned down the Ashen Stone speed paint the same way. And with those paints on my palette, I roughly wet blended them all over the skin on the minis. I put the Ashen Stone sort of grayish color speed paint on the underbellies, and the bluish color speed paint everywhere else, and blended them together on the sides of the shark minis and like under the armpit and everything. In general, I really like wet blending with speed paints, but the one thing I noticed is that occasionally I had to wick away some blue paint from the underbellies, where the blue bled a little bit too far into the light grayish areas. Once that was dry, I did some layers of gentle overbrushing of highlights, creating a really scratchy texture for the skins. I know, I am always a sucker for scratchy textures on my minis, and I have done it yet again, I admit it. Anyway, I used Gravedigger Denim, gray blue, and then some white blue, just kind of working up some highlights in stages on the blue parts of the skin. I did also mix some glaze medium into these overbrushed layers to keep them from being too dramatically stark. After that, I used, I'm pretty sure, almost pure white blue to just do a final edge highlight on the most important edges like the fins and stuff. I did the same sort of highlighting on the underbellies of the skin as well, with pale gray blue and then mixing in some white for additional highlights. At this point, I was really happy with the value transitions that I have across the minis, but I feel like they're a little bit desaturated. So I took some of this P3 Exile Blue with a good amount of glaze medium and water in it, and used it as a few sort of mid-tone and shadow glazes to punch up the saturation in the blue a little bit more. This also has the added bonus of smoothing out some of those areas where the rough overbrushing highlights are maybe a little too rough. Now that the skin is done, I move on to the other parts, and things start to get a lot more straightforward. I picked out and base coated most of the clothing with burnt red, and then I base coated the rope and some of the pieces of clothing, as well as all the teeth and bones, with this sort of medium tan khaki color. I base coated the gold armor panels and the little filigree detail bits with rich gold, and then some details like the fish hooks and some of the chains I painted with this dark silver color. That's basically all of the colors blocked in, so moving on to shading now. I used this brown wash on all of the tan and gold surfaces, and then on the red cloth, I used the Army Painter dark blue tone wash, which knocks the color down quite a lot. I like shading red with blues and purples, and also shading with this dark blue helps to unify the color a little bit more with the skin. And also, if you're a bit sloppy with this wash and it gets onto the skin a little bit, it is not really visible and doesn't really matter. Then I just did some simple layered highlights on the red cloth surfaces, starting with a mix of burnt red and bold pyrrole red as my first highlight, and then doing a couple more highlights mixing bold pyrrole red with some off-white. In general, I've found that red paints, or at least the red paints that I own, always seem to look very vibrant and intense when they're wet, but they dry looking a lot more subdued. And also, I'm not trying to spend ages highlighting these minis carefully, so I started by pushing these highlights pretty strong right from the first layer. I spent a bit more time in general on the big Croxagore shark trying to make things look nice, but most other sharks just got like 2 quick highlight passes and then I carried on. Highlighting the tans was just mixing a little bit of off-white into my khaki color, and same thing as the reds, I think I did like 2 or 3 quick highlight passes on these minis. A few of the minis have some fishing nets or other highly textured surfaces. I chose to highlight these primarily with overbrushing and dry brushing instead of doing conventional layered highlights. I moved on to highlighting the gold by mixing in some silver and doing some fairly strong dry brushes with this. Then I really pushed things by doing some almost pure silver highlights on a few of the edges and uppermost surfaces. Before painting these gold highlights, I did use some dark warm brown glazes to shade the gold further, but I ended up deciding this wasn't super vital, and I mostly skipped it when I painted the majority of the rest of the team. And that's basically all the highlights taken care of, so now it's on to some smaller detail work. I picked out the eyes with pure black, and then put a white dot in the corner of the eye to imply sort of a shiny specular highlight. Then I put a fairly thin application of a rosy red color over the mouths, and then did just 1 or 2 reddish pink highlights on this. As I mentioned earlier, all of the teeth and claws got base coated in a khaki color, and then I just did some simple highlights by mixing in some off-white. At this point, I moved on to painting a few random incidental things, like a couple of the models had tattoos that I just painted black. There's one shark that's biting off an arm that has some skin showing on it, and then there's some other small details like stitches and scars. Specifically for the scars and veins, I thinned down the color that I used for the mouths, and just used that to fairly carefully outline them. I don't think that this was a necessary step at all, but I think it adds a little bit more interest and fun storytelling to the minis. The last step on these minis was using a couple of different rust colors on the silvers, and then just going back with pure silver to highlight some of those hooks and things. I mentioned earlier that I picked out the goblin shark and the sawtooth shark to have different brownish colors on their skins instead of bluish colors, and all I did here was I just swapped out the blue to bluish white and bluish gray colors that I used for browns and skin shades. I made one of their bellies a grayish white color, and one of them I used more of a Caucasian light skin tone, just for the fun of having something different. I made the cloth and straps on these variants almost entirely red though, since the brown cloth colors would get very lost in the shark's brown skin tones. But everything else was exactly the same, no other changes to note. Moving on to the bases, I'm a pretty strong believer in that it doesn't really matter when you do any of the steps for painting your bases. I ended up mixing in the base coat and wash steps with when I was doing those stages on the rest of the minis themselves, but there's also no reason not to wait and just do this all at the end instead. I base coated the planks with dark umber, and then I used a khaki color to base coat all of the sand. I washed the planks with a mix of black wash and brown wash to really darken them down, and then when that was dry, I dry brushed it by just mixing in some off-white into my dark umber. I used a dark iron silver color to pick out all of the nails on the bases, and then I did some quick stippled and dry brushed highlights on the sand just by mixing in some off-white to my khaki color. The base rims I painted with Chimera Colors Carbon Black, and then I moved on to the last part, all of the little shells and sea creatures and such. I just used random fun bright colors for these, in some cases sticking to things that would be more realistic, and in some cases just picking like random pinks and purples and reds and stuff like that. When I was doing this, I also added a fun little Easter egg here on one of the bases. Wow, I wonder what this is from. So that's all of the minis from the actual team painted, but I know what you're all thinking. You're all thinking, I want to see that fish butt. So I guess I'll give it to you. I started by airbrushing the FISHMAN with an all-over base coat of shadow flesh, and then doing a fairly strong zenithal highlight of a sort of Caucasian human skin color of tan flesh. Then I airbrushed only the fish head part with a mix of Pro-Acryl Orange and Pro-Acryl Burnt Red, and I did a zenithal highlight on that as well, just by mixing some orange and off-white together. There's the initial airbrush gradients in place, so next was just some thin highlights and shading. This FISHMAN is mostly fairly basic shapes without too much texture, so I didn't want to be too messy, I wanted to keep it fairly neat. When I highlighted the skin on the legs, I think I was a little bit too rough with the highlights, so I did some thin shading again with my shadow flesh color, both using that to smooth out the transition areas of the skin from shadow to highlight, as well as helping with the transition from skin color to orange fish color. I also shaded the orange just a little bit more. Honestly, it was fairly minor though. And I feathered a little bit of orange glazed onto the webby feet, just to sort of imply some fishy, scaly texture down there. Same as all the other sharks, I painted the eyes black and then put a white dot in the corner. At this point, I think the FISHMAN here is looking pretty much ready to rock, so now it's just on to a couple of finishing steps. Since these are gaming minis that are probably going to be touched quite a bit, I airbrushed matte varnish over all of these minis. Then, for the larger metal bits, I came back with airbrushing a satin varnish onto them, but you could also brush it on too, just to kind of bring back a little bit of that shine. Then, while I'm manipulating the finishes on the models, I brushed gloss varnish onto all of the eyes, just to give them a sort of wet, shiny look and help them to stand out a little bit more, because otherwise the black eye kind of disappears into the head. This is also the point where I tastefully applied some blood effect paint to some of the mouths and the sort of knuckle duster things. And I did this last at the very end here, because I didn't want that blood effects paint to be dulled down by the matte varnish. And with that, my Lizardmen Proxy team is ready for some games of Blood Bowl. I also quickly painted a few tokens that came with the team, just reusing the same colors that I already used for all of these minis on the tokens as well. I'm very happy with how this team turned out, and as always, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have for me in the comments. Take care of yourself, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.